Hello everyone, I'm back to answer the rest of your guys' questions, or at least all the ones I'm able to get to this time. Be sure to subscribe if you enjoy, and let's continue. How much of a difference does 10 points for special make on a kit? Honestly, it depends. How much is the weapon playing towards that special? How good is that special? How important is it that that weapon gets that special output frequently? Those are the things that determine how much it matters. In practice, it's usually not that big of a deal, but more than people give it credit for. What exactly makes Japan so much better than everyone else? There are larger scenes, Splatoon is a lot larger in Japan in general, they all speak the same language, and there's no time zone barrier, which means you have a larger player base that can play at the same time, that cares more about the game. That's a humongous advantage. Why does a lot of the comp community hate Splatfest? I think a lot of competitive players prefer to play ranked modes, and the ranked modes not being available for 48 hours kind of sucks. I don't care about that as much these days, but let me put it this way. If you're a Turf War only player and Turf War was kicked out of rotation for 48 hours, would that be something fun for you? Probably not. But for me, the actual thing that I more dislike is that the Splatfest teas are forced upon you every single time you exit a private battle, which means it is very easy to accidentally wear your Splatfest tee in the tournament. This is such an often occurrence and always has been. Next time there's a tournament during Splatfest, watch a few players' streams and see how many times someone accidentally has a Splatfest tee on. How does the competitive community decide which weapons are meta/good and which are not? Practice, experimentation, and seeing what works. When the meta shifts, it's mostly because some new idea is tried and that idea ends up having consistent success over the old idea, and that repeats over and over. Buffs and nerfs can accelerate this process, and sometimes there is a point where it is very clear one option has proven it can work against all of the others and is the best, but that's generally how it works. It's not really a competitive community decision. It's just people tried these things, this is the thing that works, now people are going to use the thing that works. Why, in your opinion, is there such a lack of analytical competitive content? Because I think analyzing competitive Splatoon is a lot more tricky than it looks, especially at top level matches, and Splatoon also suffers from having a really fast pace, which is great in a lot of areas, but it makes it very tricky to break down the game because of how fast everything happens. I've had some VOD reviews where myself or other coaches like Ren will spend like a literal hour going over one 5-minute game, and that makes it very difficult for viewers to keep up with. Do you feel like Western comp has suffered since Jackpot's absence? So, of course, it definitely mattered, and having a staple name and brand identity to root for is important, but I think this discussion shifts largely into, is there an issue with how many pickups are at the top level rather than any team identity? I get the idea for not having as many teams right now. A lot of people are developing a lot more individual skills, what kind of comps you play change a lot, and the meta is still being figured out, which is a pretty good explanation as to why it's happening right now that there aren't that many teams. However, I think the Splatoon scene has had a long time problem with the lack of branding around players and teams, and this has only made that issue worse. There's not a whole lot to invest in when it comes to individual player storylines, and that being even more of a problem definitely hurts viewers a lot. Basically, while I think Jackpot's absence hurt the scene, the disappearance of almost every other top-level team as well, turning into pickups with a lack of proper player branding over time, has added drastically to the lack of investment we have right now as viewers. What is your experience with top players in other regions besides Japan and the West? I'd love to see more OCE and European content. Western Splatoon typically just means outside of Japan, which includes Europe. There are some differences for smaller regions, including OCE, where the gameplay is a little bit different, but I'm just not as familiar with them. Mostly because, time zone issues mean I very rarely get to play with or against those players. How much has the mass migration of comp players from Tenatech to Takaroka region positively/negatively affected both player bases? I think the biggest damage is just 2 queues existing means that queue times are longer, regardless of how many players are in each region. How does Ludi and Scrimming work? Ludi, or Leagues Under the Ink, is a league where your team gets randomly seeded into multiple divisions based on your skill. You then have a group where you play one team per week, and if you place highly in your group, you play playoffs to try and win your division. It is one of the most common competitive Splatoon events when it happens, because it's very easy for new teams to get in and fight other people at their skill level relatively consistently. Scrimming is basically just practice. Contact another team, play against them, do whatever map and mode combinations you want, run whatever compositions you want, and test out what things work and what don't. What makes or breaks most comp teams? Time. The game changes, the team changes, the meta of the game itself changes, and the players change, which means what synergies worked before might not work anymore. Teams can be adaptable, especially with good communication, but eventually there can always be something that shifts to where things don't work out anymore, and only very specific groups of people will be able to last for years and years on the same team, making the amount of adaptations that are necessary for it. How are map pools determined, and why do they exist? Map pools are a thing because trying to practice 96 map and mode combinations is just not feasible at all. Typically, these are decided by what top players consider good maps, which is a whole nother topic. But in the past year or so, I have ran polls for those players to vote on them, and then tournament organizers usually have the final say. So sometimes you will see larger ones, smaller ones, or different combinations based off who is running the actual tournament itself. But basically, it's which ones people think are good after a lot of testing. Who is the best / most accomplished player of all time? I don't really have an answer for this because there's so many different eras of the game. For example, one of the best players in Splatoon 1 is probably Kagu or Nike, and I'm willing to bet that 90% of people here have no idea who either of them are. And Kagu never made content. He was a Luna Blaster player, by the way, and Nike is a Charger, both from the early era of Splatoon 1 teams of NSTC, name subject to change, and Extermination. There are very few players that have lasted throughout all three eras, so it's kind of hard to say who's the most accomplished of all time, but my mind would go to someone like Gray, who has been a top player in all three games. So that would be my answer if I had to come up with one. Do comp players generally like when things get banned or restricted? For example, no Trizuka weapons, no charge up on pencils, no repeat weapons on the same team. It honestly just depends, like how big of an issue and how long has this issue lasted over time. But I'd say it matters most in metas where things are stale and people found out what works, and what works isn't fun. Which means right now, when the meta is very volatile, restrictions aren't really as popular. And why is there such a stigma around letting anyone into top level? Respectfully, of course. For those who don't know, the Plus server is a high-level scrim server that is voting to determine who stays in it with 3 levels, +1, +2, and +3. And as someone who has been in +1 for a very long time, the thing I would say is that if you let too many people into the higher level, then some top players will find it not worth it to find practice there because the skill level will be too broad. However, if it's too narrow and the pool of players is too low, it's more difficult to find scrims in general because of the lack of people, which has always been the struggle with the server. In my opinion, people tend to be a little bit too worried about letting in other players, and more people should be given a chance, but obviously there's always an upper and lower bound, and there's going to be a balance of that. The less people you let in, the higher the level is, and the closer skill people are to each other, but the less people you have. It's kind of just a trade-off that players have to pick between. And again, from my personal perspective, I think we could afford to let in a few more players who would likely be able to stay in that server long-term if they were given a bit of a chance to practice in it. But of course, what players people think that is going to vary from person to person in the server, which makes voting them in very difficult. And that's all the questions. Thank you so much for watching.